There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with a review of a biography of a family, the Pankhursts, The History of One Radical Family by Martin Pugh. I started this as a buddy read with Britta Bowler, October, I can't remember. And we didn't finish it together, but we both did finish. I didn't finish it till about a week ago. I read it over 2.5 months, I don't know, maybe longer. And it was a 4-star read for me. So the Pankhurst women were a mother and 3 daughters who were integrally involved in the suffragette movement at the turn of the 19th century and early 20th century, up until World War I. Emmeline Pankhurst was the mother, and after her husband died, and her husband was a suffragist and social activist par excellence, but he was much older than her, and after he died, she was not that old. She might have been in her 40s, and had these 3 adult children, and they lived in Manchester, but eventually moved up to London, and just were at the center of the suffragette movement. It's a fascinating story. I don't think it's incredibly well told in this biography, but I still really enjoyed it. So the first thing to say is, I overcame a lot of the deficiencies in this book by doing deep dives on Google. Google reading, I guess is the term. So that's why I wanted to slow right down and set Britta free to finish it at her own pace, because I was spending 15 or 20 minutes on each page, because who is this person? And I would Google them, and I would want to Google something else. It was several minutes had passed before I would come back to the book. And that made this, I would say, a semester's worth of study and reading about the suffragette movement and the Pankhursts. And I want to read much more. So Emmeline was the mum, and her oldest daughter was Christabel Pankhurst, the next daughter was Sylvia Pankhurst, and the youngest daughter was Adela. They worked together very well for about 10 minutes in the early 20th century, and then splinters and factionalism and petty disagreements and political disagreements split them apart as a family, and the suffragette movement splintered into various factions as well. They were notoriously difficult to work with. They were not comfortable working in any organization of which they were not at the head, and they were also, Pugh makes a fairly convincing case, but I would love to hear what other biographies say to make sure that he wasn't biased and just highlighting certain sources and avoiding others, because it seemed like they were borderline corrupt in the way that they pilfered money from their organizations to pay the rent and buy the groceries in a way that was not accounted for, literally, by an accountant of any kind. They did absolutely phenomenal work. They brought an eloquence and a zest and an audacity to their activism that got them imprisoned many times, and that is all told in this book. Many of the suffragettes were imprisoned and force-fed, and it was awful. They were also deeply political people, and despite their prickliness at not wanting to collaborate with anybody, they were always putting out feelers, and this would especially be Emmeline and the oldest daughter, Christabel, with the political parties in Britain of the day. And that's where the book got bogged down. I actually like reading about that. I'm deeply interested in how social movements collaborate or refuse to collaborate, successfully or unsuccessfully, with political parties. And there are pages and pages and pages of that in here. That isn't everybody's cup of tea. I enjoyed it more than Britta, I think it's safe to say. Didn't think it was necessarily a huge flaw in the book, but it did go on and on and on. What Pugh doesn't consistently do well is dramatize the incidents that are the most interesting to a lay reader like me. For example, there was an incident where one of the suffragettes vandalized a piece of art, and it was referred to so obliquely, I believe it was even in parentheses. I just thought, I would have liked to read a full page about this. It's so interesting. But again, that's where my Google reading filled in the gaps and made it that much more of a colorful reading experience. World War I broke out in 1914, and that fractured the suffragette movement and the Pankhurst family. Emmeline and Christabel by this point had been living in exile in France and secretly sneaking back and forth and still writing the suffragette newspaper, all from France, but didn't feel it safe to come because she had fled from a prison sentence. Emmeline and Christabel suddenly turned patriotic and abandoned the suffragette movement entirely and said, we have to support the troops, we have to support the government, we have to battle back Germany. We will put the suffragette movement on the back burner. Well, their followers didn't necessarily agree. Their whole family didn't necessarily agree. Sylvia, the second daughter, and Adela kept on. Emmeline and Christabel just withdrew from the movement, and the movement carried on without them. Overnight, from being persona non grata with the powers that be in Britain at the time, Christabel and her mother Emmeline became staunch allies and spokespeople for the war and for their government. One of the fascinating ways in which all of those fractures made history is that during the early days of the Russian Revolution, Emmeline was sent as a governmental delegate to Russia to meet with the Menshevik leader, that short-lived revolutionary government that was pretty reasonable, not communist. They lasted, 30 days or 60 days? It's a long time since I studied the history. And Emmeline went to Moscow or St. Petersburg and was conferring and consulting and not negotiating, but meeting with Kerensky. I think it was Kerensky. And then a few short months later, or less than a year later, her second daughter went to Bolshevik Russia to meet with Lenin, because by this time, Sylvia, the second daughter, had become a die-hard communist in Britain and had a very significant correspondence back and forth with Lenin, and in fact went to Russia to meet him. So that's how far apart the family went. Adela was sent into exile into Australia by her mother to get rid of her because she was causing problems of a left-wing political nature. And she became a really important person in the suffragette movement in Australia and in left-wing politics in Australia, and lived the rest of her life there. The Pankhursts never really got back into feminism or the suffragette movement in any serious way. The first suffragette gains came in 1918. It was only a half measure. The women aged 30 and over could vote. And then by 1928, women aged 20 or 21, the same age as men, could vote. But the Pankhursts, especially Emmeline and Christabel, were completely disengaged by that point. Emmeline never got off the anti-communist, pro-capitalist brigade and considered running as a conservative in the UK Parliament. In fact, I think she did try. They all seemed to want to get into elective politics, and none of them were successful. Christabel, after the war, she got completely effed up with religion. She became an Adventist, and all of her energies for the rest of her life were either devoted to making money by writing about her family or about the suffragettes, even though she didn't really care about any of that anymore. And the rest of her life was given to her newfound religion. Just wacky stuff. And Sylvia eventually grew out of being a communist, but she was still very left-wing, and she was the one that I think over the whole span of her life did the most good, because once she got out from under the ridiculous communist stuff, she was still very left-wing, and she did a lot of good in international politics in direct opposition to what her mother was militating for, and she attached herself to Ethiopia. To me, that was the most interesting part, because I knew absolutely nothing about Ethiopia before and during World War II. I guess I vaguely knew that it was invaded by Italy, but she became a fierce, unrelenting advocate for Ethiopia when all that started to shake down. Emperor Haile Selassie went into exile in the UK. She knew him. They worked together. They were not close friends, but they worked together very closely. And she eventually moved to Ethiopia and spent the last 6 or 7 years of her life living there and working for Ethiopia's development. But for 10 or 15 years before that, that was all she was doing in the UK. Publishing a newspaper all about Ethiopian issues. She just did so much for Ethiopia. Wow. Christabel just went loony, moved to California, and her religious stuff, blah, blah, blah. Emmeline died in 1928, and she had done some pretty good stuff in her day. Adela did a lot of really great stuff, left-wing politics and feminist stuff and socialist stuff in Australia. But the family never kind of came back together. So absolutely fascinating. The book itself is not a 4-star read, but my experience of the book was. If at least 3/4 of what I'm talking about sounds interesting to you, you might like to try this book. Or If you know of a better book about the Pankhursts or about the mother, about Emmeline Pankhurst or Christabel Pankhurst that I should read next, I want to. It has definitely fired my imagination. This was an unforgettable read, and it matches my blouse. Thanks for watching.